Most casino brand projects go sideways before the agency is ever even briefed. Not because the creative is wrong, but because the budget ran out, because the scope was wrong from the start. A refresh and a rebrand are not the same project, and a repositioning is something else entirely. Choosing the wrong one doesn't just cost money, it delays the work that actually needs to happen by a year or more, sometimes even longer. So before you brief anyone, before you approve any budget, before a single design concept gets in the front of the room, you need to know which category you're actually in. And that's exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to Drive Time Marketing. Hi there, and welcome back to Drive Time Marketing, the show where we help casino marketers turn strategy into action and insights into impact. I'm Julia Carcamo. Today, we're closing out a series we've been building on, casino rebranding. What it takes to do one well, when it's a wrong call, and now how to size the scope before you commit to anything. If you've been following along, we started with the cornerstone, the full strategic process for executing a rebrand successfully. Then we made the contrarian case. Most of what lands on the table as a brand problem isn't one. The root cause is almost always execution, offer, or experience, and a new logo isn't going to close that gap. This episode is for the operators who cleared that gate. The case is real. Something in the brand genuinely needs to change. Now the question is, how much? A refresh, a full rebrand, a repositioning, and there's a fourth situation, one I call a hybrid rebrand, that most regional operators are living right now without a name for it. So let's get into it. Here's the mistake I see more than I should. A property has a real problem. Guests aren't connecting. Competitors are pulling visits. The brand might feel generic. Leadership puts a rebrand on the table, and then the budget gets approved, the agency gets called, the logo changes, and the new sign goes up. And then 12 months later, the same problem is still there. That's not a creative failure. That's more of a scope failure. A refresh, a rebrand, and a repositioning require different levels of work, different capital commitments, and different levels of organizational disruption. And when operators choose the wrong one, usually a refresh when they needed a rebrand, they've bought themselves a polished version of the same problem. You may not all recall this, but the Gap logo moment in 2010 is the cautionary version of this. They changed the logo with no strategic rationale and then reversed the decision within a week. That wasn't a failed rebrand. It was a failed refresh, a visual change disconnected from any brand thinking. The lesson isn't that logo changes are dangerous. It's that visual changes without strategic grounding have no foundation to stand on. So before we get to the signals and timelines, I want to name the categories clearly because if you're fuzzy on the definitions, everything that follows is going to be guesswork. So let's talk about what each one actually is. A refresh is a surface level update to how an existing brand presents itself. New logo, updated color palette, refreshed typography, environmental graphics that finally match what's on the digital side. What a refresh is not is a new strategy. You're not changing who you're talking to, what you stand for, or how the operation delivers on that promise. Starbucks is the example I come back to. When they removed the word mark from their logo in 2011, keeping only the siren mark, most customers didn't consciously notice the change. The brand was consistent enough in experience, in environment, in what walking into a Starbucks felt like, that the visual evolution didn't disrupt the relationship. The strategy didn't change, the expression just caught up. That's a refresh. Now, a rebrand is strategic. It's not primarily a visual update, though that might be part of the work. It's a repositioning of what the property stands for and how it delivers on that promise at every guest touchpoint. Audience research, a redefined brand promise, operational alignment before the logo ever changes. Dove is my example here. I bet you didn't realize that their moisturizer patent expired, and any competitor could copy the formula at that point. So instead of chasing a new product claim, Dove rebuilt the brand around a value of authentic beauty. The Real Beauty campaign barely touched the visual identity. The logo changed, but very little. But what Dove stood for changed completely. The strategic foundation shifted. The visual expression followed. That's a rebrand. And a repositioning is the deepest work of all. It's a fundamental redefinition of who the property serves. Not a rebrand with a bigger budget, a redefinition of the audience. Target is the classic example. Same stores, same locations, deliberately different customer. They made a sustained strategic decision to move upmarket, designer collabs, better store experience, a cleaner aesthetic, while keeping the core value proposition intact. They didn't change their logo, they changed who they were for. That's a repositioning. Netflix is the more dramatic version. DVD by mail to streaming wasn't a brand refresh or even a rebrand. It was a fundamental redefinition of what the company was. Everything changed except the audience relationship. And there you have it. 3 different scopes, 3 different capital commitments, 3 different levels of organizational disruption. We've been talking about how to size the scope of a casino brand project, the difference between a refresh, a rebrand, and a repositioning. Let's keep going because there's a 4th situation I think is worth naming, and that is the hybrid case. I mentioned it at the top, and it's the one that I think most regional operators are living without a name for it. And the situation is this: your property has changed, not because you planned a formal rebrand, but because over this last several years, you've made a series of operational decisions that added up to something real. New leadership brought a different philosophy. You invested in the food and beverage program. The entertainment calendar evolved. The guest experience feels genuinely different from what it was 5 years ago. The brand didn't lead those changes. The operation did. And now the brand hasn't caught up. This is what I call a hybrid rebrand, and it changes the scope of the project significantly. In a standard rebrand, the discovery work, the research, the audience work, the positioning takes most of the time. In a rebrand, in a hybrid rebrand, that work is largely already done. Your organization has been living the answer for years. What's missing is the documentation and the visual identity that reflects who you've actually become. The timeline lands on the shorter end of the rebrand range. The capital commitment is still real, but you're not starting from scratch. You're capturing what already exists and aligning the expression to match. The question to ask yourself is, does our current brand accurately represent who we are today or who we were 5 years ago? If the honest answer is 5 years ago, you're in hybrid rebrand territory and you're further along than you think. So how do you know which one you're in? Well, there are specific signals for each level, and I laid them out in detail in my post. I'll include the link in the show notes. But here are the 3 diagnostic questions that will put you in the right category before you write the first brief and take the first agency meeting. First, is our brand promise still credible and differentiated in the market? Not aspirationally, actually, in the eyes of your guests and the competitive landscape as it exists today. If the answer is no, you're not in refresh territory. Second, is the experience on the floor consistent with the brand we've been marketing? This is the one that separates visual problems from operational problems. If the visual identity is ahead of the operation, you don't have a brand problem, you have an operations problem. No amount of design work is going to fix that. Now, third is about the audience, and the question is, has our audience shifted or do we need it to? If the answer is yes, you're in repositioning territory. Regardless of what leadership would prefer, audience reality doesn't negotiate. Honest answers to these 3 questions will tell you which category you're in, and that's the conversation to have before the agency meeting, not after. That's the scope decision: refresh, rebrand, repositioning, or the hybrid case that's more common than anyone talks about. Get this decision right before anyone sees a brief, before any agency is in the room, and before a single design concept gets presented. The brand audit checklist linked in the show notes can help you work through the diagnostic questions with your team if you want a structured starting point. And if you've done the diagnostic work and you want a working conversation about what the right scope looks like for your property, the brand diagnostic and strategy kickstart call is like 30 minutes. It's no pitch, no commitment, just an honest read of where you are, and I'll include that link in the show notes as well. And this closes out our rebranding series. Next, we're moving to the question that sits right behind scope: differentiation. Once you know what kind of brand work you're doing, you still have to answer what you're differentiating from and for whom. That's where the real work begins. Until then, I'm Julia Carcamo, and thanks for joining me on this week's edition of Drive Time Marketing.